Yeah, this video is going to have some spoilers. You can use the timestamps below to skip around. Hey everyone, we're gonna rank Fire Emblem games today on a tier list based on how good and fun the final battles are. So that includes the final boss fights, as well as maybe the map around them. We all know there's games where the final map is just the final boss and there's not a whole lot happening, so those games desperately need that buff, but generally I'm gonna be focused on like the final fight. And how good it is for me depends on the design of the fights, first and foremost, how fun the map around it is, how difficult it is. Usually I play the higher difficulties in Fire Emblem, so I'm going to be focused on that, but sometimes I might lean towards the lower difficulties, either because I think it's relevant or because it's my personal experience. But also very important, the music. And it's just my opinion, so let's get started. So, FE1, the very first one. Medius is in the center of a map with a maze full of enemies around that you need to get through to get to him. The player phase music is different, and I mean different as in it's different from the player phase music from the entire game. This is great because you heard the same track all game long. So it's just nice to hear something different. Medius himself is kind of tough. He can't be attacked by ranged weapons, which includes Goto, which I find hilarious. The way we talk about Gotos today, you think their entire purpose is to give you a fighting chance against the final boss, and he just blocks ranged attacks. It helps though that Marth is really good in this game, with the Falchion and just in general, with every enemy being kind of taunted into attacking Marth over even your frailest healer. So you have a great incentive to raise him up, and it really pays off in the final fight. Tiki is pretty good against him too. I don't believe she is super effective against him, but she still works really well. Most of the other enemies in FE1, including on the final map, they just kind of suck. Particularly the Ballisticians. I find those especially funny because if we've only played Shadow Dragon, then you might be used to them having like 10 range, but here they just have 2 range, so they're much easier to take care of. But the other enemies, they're also not that much above what you're used to in FE1, which is not a whole lot. I kind of like how the game splits up your army into a bunch of small groups and they have to fend for themselves. In FE1, you cannot exactly determine what order you're deploying units in or where they're going to be deployed, so depending on how it works out, it can be a great disaster, or it can be really interesting if you get a good loadout, but I admit it's kind of based on RNG since you don't really have a plan for this beforehand unless you have made a plan beforehand. I do gotta dock some points from FE1 for how good warp is in this game. They sort of try to defend against the warp skip by putting a Manakete in front of Medius, but generally that just means you use one more warp to get through the Medius and you're just kind of done with the chapter. So overall, I don't think this is a very challenging one at all. I'm gonna throw it in C tier. I don't think it's bad. Like, I have a D tier for things I just do not like. I think this one is fine, especially if you take into account how old the game is and how revolutionary this concept was. Like the game as a whole, not this final chapter in particular. So I think it's fine, and a lot of battles are probably going to end up around that BC tier, because Fire Emblem is not really known for having like epic final boss fights. Usually people like the game as a whole, and they enjoy the closure of a final chapter and how like grandiose it can be. Is that the word that English people use? I think it is. But generally, I don't think the strength of Fire Emblem as a series lies in boss fights, not even final boss fights. Usually if they're good fights, like mechanically, they stand out among the rest because it's kind of rare, or it's the story weight behind it that makes it stand out. We're going to continue along the lines of the Arcanea chapters because, well, that makes the most sense to just keep... I don't want to keep having to refer back to FE1 with Gaiden in between. So we're going to get into FE3 Book 1 now, which is mostly the same final chapter. The game cut a couple chapters, so it's earlier in the game, I guess. Like, it's chapter 20 instead of 24, but that's it. FE3 just kind of cut out the battle stations. I think it's because Book 2 uses real battle stations with actual long-range attacks, and so they thought it'd be weird to have the FE1 battle stations represented by FE10 or FE3 battle stations. You know what I mean. Dragonstones went through a big change. They reduce your attack speed to 0 now, kind of like javelins. This means that Tiki is relatively worse off against Medius because she can't double anymore. Medius is also like slowed the way the fuck down, of course, but Tiki is still usable against him. The best option is of course still Marth. Medius has that weird power now that you might know from other games where he halves your attack power, and he's on a throne. So from my experience, most units, even if they're trained all the way to their stat caps at 20 all around except for HP, they tend to not do a whole lot of damage to him. But Medius' hit rate itself is so garbage that I don't feel it matters a whole lot. He has 1-2 range now, but you can also 1-2 range him. FE3 has forced dismounting in indoor chapters, which includes the final chapter, so units like Wyverns and Paladins will be forced to just be a generic class called Knight that holds a sword, and that will limit your options quite a bit. But if you train someone like Draug or Lorenz, you can still use the Gradivis at least, and magic is still an option. Generally, I think this battle plays out mostly the same as it does in the original FE1. It's not bad, but it's not my favorite by a long shot. A funny tidbit about FE3 is that you have to seize Medius' throne to actually end the game. Killing him is not enough. It's one of the very few games where killing the final boss doesn't just take you to the credits. It would be very funny if you died to an enemy after killing Medius, like Marth slays the final dragon and then a random generic enemy just comes in and finishes Marth off. But killing him does stop reinforcements, so this is pretty unlikely to happen. I don't think this is like wholly different from FE1, but considering FE3 is like a more polished version in some ways, I'm gonna put it above FE1. I also want to talk about Book 2, but first I want to just finish off this this version of the chapter, or well, you know what I mean, the final chapter from FE1. So we'll get with the Shadow Dragon remake of it. I think this is the best version of this map and the worst version of the final boss. The map itself is a lot more challenging with the 10 range ballistas around, and I'm going to focus a little bit on harder difficulties, especially Hard 5 Merciless, where it's just an epic disaster all around. It feels a lot more cramped because the stronger enemies are, the more area you're going to be denied for deploying your own units, especially the supportive ones. So it becomes a lot more challenging, a lot more interesting in that way. The remix of the final chapter music in Shadow Dragon is absolute fire, one of my favorite tracks in the series. I'm probably going to be saying this a lot. I did say the strength of Fire Emblem as a series is not really the final boss fights, but they sure do power up the music for this one. And Fire Emblem is already known for having really good music. That said, the map itself still suffers from being vulnerable to warp cheese, so you're not going to enjoy that music for a very long time. Of course, you can warp someone to kill a Manakete and then warp someone to kill Medius. But there are some other fun ways to cheese it, like you can block the reinforcements from the bottom right by moving units onto the forts there. You can use the Geosphere to kill off the fortified priests to make sure that all the damage you do to enemies is basically permanent, and you can, kind of grind them down. You have Ballisticians, which can hit Medius from like really long range. I finished an Iron Man once with I think it was a crit from Beck, of all people, just unexpectedly critting Medius to death. You can do a lot of funny things like that in FE11. I really like how flexible that game is. I do think all versions of this map, from FE1 to FE3 to FE11, suffer from ambush reinforcements. This is a game-wide problem, but I think it's at its worst in FE11 because the enemies are a lot stronger and more accurate, so it's much more likely to lead to an accidental death if one spawns next to your support unit or something like that. Whereas in FE1 or FE3, they might not OHKO or they might miss, or at least it's a lot more likely. Medius himself in Shadow Dragon is way too strong on higher difficulties. And it's not often that I will call a final boss too strong, like that's supposed to be part of the deal. The game hints very heavily towards Marth and Thalkion being like his kryptonite, like you have to get the Star Sphere, and you have to get the Light Sphere and get him to Goto, get the Starlight Tome, and then use it to beat Garneth and get the Thalkion. Like they're treating that like your most important quest. But then they made Medius strong enough to one-round even a Marth with capped speed, HP, and defense. From the top of my head, I know for sure he gets doubled on the highest difficulties. And even if you go down from Merciless mode Hard 5 to like Hard 2 or Hard 3, I think that's still often going to be the case from the top of my head. I usually play either normal mode or Hard 5. There are a handful of classes that do not get one-rounded, like Swordmaster and Horseman, if they have capped or near capped speed. But the rest of Shadow Dragon discourages these classes quite a bit from using them, and so you might not be trained in the right weapon ranks, even if you can reclass a unit to them, so they're not great solutions to this problem. Worm Slayers are not effective against Medius. Nagi and Goto, your two late game pre-promotes, they just get wrecked by Medius. Your best option to beat a jacked up Medius is literally a suicide mission with Tigi or Nagi. Did I say Tigi? I think I said Tigi. And then you revive her with the Alm Staff that you get in the previous chapter, chapter 24, and then do it again. That is your best way of beating Medius, along with Warp. So it's not exactly a great battle. It's like either you cheese it or you're going to have a bad time, or you have trained up someone like, I don't know, a Sword Master from the beginning just to try and have someone that isn't the cheeser. So yeah, I don't think this one is great. I still enjoy the difficulty of it more than the kind of slogfest from the previous version. So I'm going to put it above, but not far above. This gap is not going to change a whole lot, I think, between these three games. So like I said, we might as well wrap up Arcanea while we're here and get into FE3 Book 2. I promise you this won't change the ranking a whole lot. I think the final map of FE3 Book 2 is cool. Medius this time, he's back. He starts surrounded by 4 kidnapped bishop ladies. I'm not a big fan of the damsel in distress trope that Kaga likes to employ so widely throughout the early Fire Emblem series, but in this case, it ended up making for an interesting gameplay concept. Having to bring Minerva, Merrick, Julian, and Sirius to this map and all the maps before it, the endgame sequence, it's 2 more maps before this, it adds some difficulties if you didn't train them, and it adds some meaning to training them if you did, so I view this as an absolute win-win. All these units that I just named are pretty good anyway at fighting, except for Julian. He's good for getting items, but keeping him out of danger is something that you've had practice with all game anyway, so I don't think it's a big deal that you have to keep your thief alive for 1 more map. Or 3 more maps. There's another gimmick with the Earth Dragons and the Binding Shield in the final chapter, where they keep appearing at the start of enemy phase, so ambush spawns, and then after enemy phase is over and they've had a chance to attack, Marth makes them vanish with the Binding Shield. They seem to have pretty bad hit rates, but they do a good chunk of damage to everyone they get to attack because they ignore defense, so they're still kind of dangerous, but you can see where they would spawn from, so you can kind of take it into account, but because there's a random element in which ones are going to spawn, it's not great, but it's just kind of funny, and I personally never got screwed over by it, so it must be fine. You can't just staff cheese the Book 2 finale like you could in Book 1 or FE1. But you can still do it if you think about it a little bit, which I like better. Like if it's just a simple warp skip, I think that's boring. But if you have to do something slightly fancy with like some kind of tool that you save for the occasion, I think that's fine. In this example, you have the Again Staff in FE3, which is great. I love this item. It lets all of your allies move again, all of them. Just regardless of whether they already moved or not, they get another turn. Well, if they didn't already move, then they don't get an extra turn. But you get what I mean, right? It dances everyone, which makes this battle a lot easier if you saved it for the occasion. It's one of those things that you probably won't have if you didn't train anyone for, especially that. The weapon rank requirement for Again is really high, but it is so satisfying when it works, and I always try to hoard at least 1 or 2 uses for the final chapter because it really helps a lot. Medius himself, I believe he still has the attack halving power that he had in Book 1. The battle itself against him, I don't think there's a whole lot to say. You know, the Marth is still good, etc. Funnily enough, there is still a throne in the Book 2 version, just like there was in Book 1. This time, you're never really going to be able to die to it. I've actually never tried seizing that throne before Medius dies, but I don't think it's possible. In terms of music, I don't have much to say about the music that's playing most of the time, but there is one theme I really love in this one, and that's, well, the theme of love, which plays when you're talking to the 4 sisters that Medius kidnapped. That track is fantastic, and I love hearing it every time. And, you know, speaking of every time, that one is also playing in the FE12 version. It's just an absolutely amazing remix. Fire Emblem never misses. I'm not a big fan of the music they put on the player phase for this one, though. It's very reminiscent of church magic. Church music. That doesn't make it bad. It's fitting because we're at an altar where Medius is literally making sacrifices to himself. But it doesn't have that upbeat, intense final chapter energy to it that I crave when I'm about to have my blue-haired prince stab a dragon with their special sword. I don't mind it when they experiment with a different concept every once in a while, but this music always annoys me and I find it distracting. The concept with the 4 sisters in the remake is the same, except now you don't have to drag the 4 dudes through the first 2 maps of the endgame sequence. You could just deploy them in the last part and that's it. In addition, you can also reclass them to other classes for completely free, and the rescue staff can be used by anyone since it's an E-rank staff as opposed to the UN personal that it was in FE3. So it is way easier to either reclass them to like a high move class like Paladin or to a Bishop to have them rescue each other across the map. And in that way, setting up staff chains is just way easier. On the other hand, they nerfed the Again staff, and now it only targets one person as opposed to the whole freaking team. It still has infinite range, but you have to choose as opposed to just say everyone. So in that sense, it's a little harder, a little easier. I'm not sure which is the easier one because it's been a while since I played the FE3 version, but it's possible in both to staff cheese it. The Medius battle is like an improved version of Shadow Dragon's Medius. His stats are still cracked, but Marth now gets +2 in every stat from the Binding Shield, and that just barely lets him escape getting doubled by Medius, if he's speed capped, although if your Marth gets screwed, you might still be in trouble. Fortunately for this Medius, you don't need Marth. I mean, you never need Marth for Medius, but this time other units can do damage and survive if their speed cap is high enough and they have high enough stats, and fortunately FE12 is kind of built around this because almost every unit in this game has cracked growth rates, so it's a lot easier to get some endgame units that can do real damage to Medius and survive him. It's still like a high-ish benchmark, but it's reachable for a lot of good units, especially good units. The Earth Dragon gimmick is still kind of there, where they spawn an enemy phase and they disappear due to the Binding Shield, but they added a bunch of other dragon types, which are probably gonna mess up any unit that faces 2 or more of them. It's pretty hard, but not in a fun way. It feels a bit spammy, like there's no terrain or walls or anything, so they all just come at you. And to me, when I play this map, I feel like it wants to be cheesed, or at the very least cleared in 2 turns. I don't think you're meant to take on all these dragons yourself. Now, that's a coherent design that New Mystery has going on in general, and I don't think it's bad conceptually or inherently. I think pushing a player to keep going is usually healthy, but because the dragons are so numerous and so strong, even super high level units can't really survive long here. So if you want to play slowly, you don't really have that option unless you have some sick strategy in mind that I couldn't think of. And I think for most players that isn't really enjoyable. I think maps that are fun to play slowly but can be cheesed with some clever strategizing, I think that's the fun way to do this, and I think this is not the way. I don't think this is that. Now, I will admit, I used to have a worse opinion on FE12 Medius. I used to think that on higher difficulties, you basically had to cheese Medius with rigging crits or something like that, like Thoron or something. And since then, various people have proven to me that you don't have to do that. So I think the boss fight itself and the concept with the 4 sisters is still fine. But I personally just don't really enjoy this map. So I'm gonna put it in C tier somewhere again. I don't dislike it. I just think it's kind of whatever. So I guess it's like better than the cracked Medius from FE11, so I'll throw it here in C tier still. Like I said, Fire Emblem not known for the good boss fights, but I promise there's some really good final boss fights that we'll get into later. Speaking of FE2, alright, it's time for Gaiden. I think the final map of Gaiden is fascinating. It has everything in it that should make players hate it. It has enemies that summon more enemies, and it has swamps. If there's anything people say that they hate about Valentia, it is those 2 things. But I think this map just works. It's probably my favorite map in the game. It might just be the banger song, because even the NES version of this final track just sounds so good. I think the map doesn't feel as bad to play as other Swamp or Kanto maps, because this is the only map where you have every single tool in the game at your disposal. So you have all your warps, all your fortifies, your Falchion, your Mage Ring, your Speed Ring, your Falcon Knights, your Dread Fighters, and compared to those, the enemy hasn't got anything on you. It's not that there's nothing on the map that isn't like strong or powerful. Jeddah is back on this map with a magic ring, and he has that funky restriction where you can only hurt him during every turn that's divisible by 4. You have the option to ignore him, but he is kind of in the way, and defeating him is probably easier. And he's annoying, but I like that he adds a threat level to the final map. The Duma fight itself is pretty neat too. It's a neat little mix where everyone can contribute, but you still usually want to finish with Alma and the Falchion. Most final boss fights in Fire Emblem are pretty much either the Lord is by far the best at doing this, or just use your best units, the Lord doesn't matter. And Duma is right in the middle between those 2 things, and I like that. Gaiden also guarantees that Alm gets a critical hit if he is adjacent to Celica, like some kind of super support, which I think is a nice touch. The iconic shield throw that Alm does when he finishes off is super cool. You can finish Duma also with Nosferatu due to, I think, a programming oversight, which I find super funny. And that's probably the best opportunity to take a screenshot and show it to your friends on Discord as a flex. I think of that as a flex. I don't think my friends agree with me, but I think it is. I also like that all the individual enemies in this chapter have names. It doesn't change a single thing in practice, but if you're into like headcanon and discussing that kind of thing, I think it can be fun to talk about, you know, what that says about the final chapter enemies. Yeah, you can use your infinite range warp in this map to skip a lot of it, but since you cannot just go up to Duma and one-round him, it still requires a bit more thought, which, if you've been paying attention so far, I think is a good thing. It's not that easy to survive Duma and all the witches and other enemies around him. To be fair, I think it is a bit too punishing to fail at this map, since if you die here in Gaiden, I believe you have to redo the entire dungeon section before it. Nowadays, I think most people play this on their Nintendo PC and they just make a save state before the fight starts, so this is not a very relevant drawback in practice, but technically that is part of the game as intended, I guess, so I thought I would mention it. I like this one a lot, in case you couldn't tell, so I'm going to put it in A tier. So the remake for the Gaiden final map is also really good, to no one's surprise. It's a bit more polished with a couple of differences, some good and some not so good. Before the battle starts, you have a prep screen now, and you can save beforehand. Wow, voice crack. So no longer are you punished for losing in the final chapter. You don't have to go back through that dungeon, you could just start at the start of the map, which is what most maps are like, and I think that's a good change. And you also have Milla's turn wheel now, which probably also affects the way you play, even if you probably should, I don't know how to describe it. Usually I feel like I play Fire Emblem with turn wheels as if it's not Fire Emblem with turn wheels for the most part, but then I have turn wheel as like kind of a backup. But it's also probably a good idea to play as if you have turn wheel if you're like, if you can get a huge advantage out of it. Now, what I'm not a big fan of is that at the start of the chapter, you can freely reposition units between Alm and Celica's groups, and it undermines that narrative that Alm and Celica are split apart and trying to unite, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that you can just teleport units back and forth between their groups. I usually self-impose not to do that for that reason. I know there's more chapters like that in Fire Emblem where that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but in this one I feel like it's especially egregious. All the white magic spells in SOV have limited range as opposed to Gaiden where they have infinite range, and that makes healing and warping less powerful. Warp in particular requires some more positioning that I think overall that's a positive change. It means you have to think about it a little more. I like having a little bit of think in my strategy game sometimes. Jedha also works a little bit differently, and he now counts individual attacks, meaning only every 4th attack hits him, which is different from when you can hit him every 4th turn. And this changes the best strategy against him, but it doesn't really functionally change his purpose on the map, and that's another thing to take into account on top of all the moguls and the witches and the other enemies that come at you. Alm no longer auto-crits with Celica next to him, but he is still really good against Duma with the Falchion, and he can still finish Duma with the Nosferatu, which is, I think it's really funny that they kept that in. I feel like Duma himself is a bit more of a threat in this one, just from memory fighting him, it has been a while for this one. And of course the graphics and the sounds and everything on this map is just better, so I enjoy this map a lot more than Gaiden, and the same goes for the final fight itself, even though it's mechanically not that different. But the game itself is not so different that I'm going to put it in a different tier, so I'll just put it above Gaiden because I like the polished version a little bit more. Alright, that's enough about games that have the white wings in them, so let's get into FE4. Final map for FE4, like all maps in this game, is massive, and if you think about it, it should count as multiple chapters. It is one coherent bit, but I'm not going to judge it by the entirety of the final map. I'm going to go ahead and mostly talk about the last bit after you seize Frege. That is the moment that the final boss appears on the map, and that I think is the most fair way to judge it. I do think it's great how FE4 manages to give almost every holy bloodline relevance in the final portion of the game. Almost every house or holy weapon can or does appear in final battle on various sides, with the obvious exception of Fjalar, because, you know, that's the whole climax of chapter 10. I think that's a good way to wrap up the game, all about conflicts between these various nobles and their houses, the consequences of their actions at large, and about whether they have a right to rule in the first place. And when you seize Frege, a bunch of things come at you at once. Ishtar comes out with her army of sages and heroes and high priests. But most importantly, there's 3 Falconites with her, and they have some of the most stacked skill sets of all time. They have Nihil to stop crits, which includes bow effectiveness, as well as Pursuits critical, adept, and they have leg rings. And then earth seals to have 1 or 2 range and heal. They're hilarious. Thank you, Kaga. Their AI also makes them triangle attack you, which is really funny. You can also exploit it because they will attack someone like Shannon or Ares at 1 range, and that might make them suicide, whereas if they attack that range, they'd be more safe. Ishtar herself is also a massive threat, as always, in all 3 of her appearances, with Adept and High Speed, to just blake a lot of people with Mjolnir, but thankfully Celefor Ares can usually beat her. And then you're dealing, and while you're dealing with that, there's a brainwashed Julia approaching you, and you have to pass her by to get to Manfoy and kill him, so you can break the spell on Julia and talk to her, and then Julia can go get Naga. And then you can use Naga to deal with all the Dreadlords, or Deathlords I think they're called, which is an infantry army of stat and skill stacked enemies with high tier weapons. And those you can basically only fight while under fire from Julia sitting on the castle with a meteor tome. Narratively, I think the Julia and Dreadlord portions are well done. Naga, like the tome itself, is like really good, a bit too good. It adds 20 to basically all of Julia's stats, which are already good in the first place if you train her at all. Even if she's not maxed out, she can hold her own better than most units, so I usually find that this final portion is a bit slow, especially because Naga forces animations on, so if you've already seen the Golden Dragon rise from the ground once, you've kind of seen it all. So your options for the final bit is basically either you super carefully work your way through Julius's army without Naga, or you just Naga everything, and neither way is challenging or interesting, I think, and it's always FE4 level slow, and so are the moments leading up to it. They have a lot of dead time where you're just moving away from Julia towards the castle, like trying to kite around her. Not a whole lot happening between Ishtar killing and killing Manfoy. It's just kind of dead time. The battle versus Julius himself is, of course, a foregone conclusion if you're using Naga. You can almost one-round him. I think you need a couple of depth procs to get it done. There is a couple of other glitchy methods to beating him. You can Berserk the Hell Dreadlord with him, and then he brings Julius to 1 HP and you just finish him off with, well, anything. It's a small novelty, just like the Nosferatu kill on that other boss. Or you can use Selef to slowly whittle him down with a Tearfing if you have maxed out strength. Either way, the only really exciting part of this battle is the music versus Julius, which is fantastic, but other than that, it's not a super interesting fight, I think. So it is one of big pluses and minuses. So I'm going to reward it for its ambition instead of averaging them out and throw them in B tier for nice, but I think I'm being generous here. Now we get to FE5, Thracia 776, of course one of my favorite games, and this final battle is also one of my favorites. The final boss is on a throne in the center of the map, locked behind a magic seal, and to break that seal you have to occupy the 6 tiles spread around the map in different rooms, and each one of those rooms is guarded by a powerful Deathlord boss with super threatening skills and weapons and stats. Probably sounds familiar. And those Deathlords can have the portraits of units of yours that you lost on your way there, just to rub it in it, you had a couple deaths. And the rooms are locked with one of the most funny and unfair enemy types right behind it, a sorcerer with a 3 to 10 range tome that can one-shot a lot of your units thanks to their high base magic and then the plus 10 magic that they get from the magic floor inside the door. And then also, to deal with each of these individual rooms, your team is split up in 6 squads of 3. You cannot really choose who goes where, at least not in the vanilla version. You can manipulate with your deployment order if you're really smart in previous maps, but no one does that. Or if you're playing the latest patch, the latest generation patch, there's an option in the options menu that you can use to rearrange your units. It is challenging to do this no matter whether you move them around or not. I personally enjoy sometimes just playing it with what I get, but I get rearranging units. Either way, the map is just very interesting on a cognitive level, because you got to figure out who goes where, who deals best with the armor that's inside the rooms, who deals best with the individual bosses, who can deal with what sorcerer. And then the map music, it's the same as a lot of other maps in this game, unfortunately. It's a good theme, but I like it when it's unique. But the boss battle itself, of course, has like one of the best in the series. The battle itself is pretty easy. Veld, or Roberto as it used to be known, it's not 100% trivial, but if you have like 4 Seti and you use one Sorcel on set, and then he tends to just one-round him. It's just, I like the Dawn's description of Veld. That's like, it's not a dragon, it's not a guy riding a dragon, it's just a dude. It's just a single Dark Bishop. His stats are good, but it's not exactly the epic final chapter battle that you're looking for. I just think the map itself is really neat. It's a good example of infinite range warp helping, but doesn't outright crush the challenge. The biggest knock on the chapter is the potential to softlock yourself. There's all these locked doors, and if you don't have door keys to open them all, then it's pretty hard to beat the chapter quickly. And the map does have a lot of time pressure, and you have those Fenrir druids hitting you from afar. So a lot of people think you can softlock yourself in this chapter by not bringing door keys. I think it's a fact that you can beat this chapter on most playthroughs. I did a video where I showed you can beat it with basically no door keys or unlocking any doors, just using warp and rewarp and rescue to move around instead. But I will admit that if you don't have those, and you don't have door keys, and you don't have thieves, then it gets really hard, if not impossible. So that is a bit of a drawback. And at the very least, even if you have some of those things, it's still going to be a step up in difficulty compared to last chapters. But I personally enjoy this chapter a lot, so I'm going to throw it at the top of A tier right now. I think it's a fun challenge. FE6, the Binding Blade. I think this one gave the series a reputation for underwhelming final boss fights. If I only count the final map, like the actual final chapter, then this one just has no real gameplay to talk about. Narratively, I like what they did with Roy and the Binding Blade, not wanting to actually kill Idun, just defeat her, and basically just subdue her so she stops. But if I count the map before it, which I think I will, it's a little better. Not by much. The map before, chapter 24, is basically one straight, one tile wide hallway through some throne rooms that you gotta seize with Roy, and inside are just a single enemy type, the Manichees, that your units either can kill with I think they're called like divine weapons in this game, or they can't. There's nothing in between. And it's a fun time to use all your legendary weapons, I guess, but it's not super exciting after a while because the battles are kind of binary, like you either win or you don't, and you take a lot of damage in between, so you like have to heal that, I guess. But how interesting that really. And it's just kind of a slog, especially if you didn't buy any boots from the secret shop chapter 21. I personally do that all the time, and so this chapter results in an interesting puzzle of how to move everyone around efficiently, figuring out how fast I can seize the next throne room. It's kind of a self-imposed challenge, so that's neat, but it's still far from my favorites. And because it's technically called Chapter 24, I can't even really in good conscience call it the final battle. The battle versus Idun herself is usually a one-turn affair, with Roy just bonking her if he's received any training at all. Most other units do very little damage to Idun, a little bit to help if your Roy is like really strength screwed or something, I guess, or if you're playing on 0% growth, but most of the time it's just Roy use Binding Blade and it's over. There are some other Manakee spawns, but they barely impact the battle at all. They're like reinforcements, or there's like a couple on the map, but they don't really do anything. And so I guess the last thing I can say on this is that the final boss theme absolutely slaps. They never get it wrong. I'm going to have to put it in the crowded C tier once again. I don't dislike this one. I still think it's good enough for C tier, but it doesn't do a whole lot for me. So I'm trying to remember where I put it. Above the Arcanega ones. That'll do. So we'll throw it like here. That's okay. Now FE7, this is another two-parter. You got Light Part 1 and you got your Light Part 2. Just like with FE6, if we only talk about the actual final map, Light Part 2, there is not too much going on. There's a fire dragon, it's got a question mark amount of HP, it's actually 120, and most likely you just use Athos with Luna to win. Most experienced players just do that. There are some alternatives, but they're all worse. You can do Canas, who is like Athos Jr. with Luna. You can use the Lords, they can maybe help, but there's a chance that they get doubled or one-hit killed, or depending on how much you've trained them and how screwed they got. The map has a bunch of enemies. Well, it has like 4 or 6 like magical enemies with long-range homes and status staffs, but they don't really impact much of anything because they're locked in rooms almost outside of your range. You just have to move units a little bit and you just can just ignore them. And the fight itself, I also think doesn't have a whole lot of emotional weight behind it, because this really is just a random fire dragon. He's really big and really threatening, but he's not really a villain, and I think it's more fun if the conflict is a bit more personal. I also don't think the music in this one is great. Like, if I look at all the other chapters so far, like, I've been praising the music for almost every battle here, and this one is just, it's alright, I guess. Now, if I factor in the battle right before, Light Part 1, it gets a lot better. It's reminiscent of a certain other game I like, you know, one boss, but he's locked behind a door that only opens if you fight all the other bosses, which are also locked behind doors. You know, that might ring a bell. I think that part is really fun. The enemies are numerous and strong enough to be a threat, but not so numerous and strong that there's no way to beat them with clever positioning. They're in like rooms that are locked with like a one-tile choke point, so if you're smart, you can lock them in place and they won't threaten the whole arena, but if you let them get out, then it gets very scary for you. But the game gives you like Aethos to deal with them. If you have Luna, he's really, really powerful against like most of them. In fact, he's the best unit by far at that point. I like this part. I enjoy playing it. I don't like the main battle music too much, but I do enjoy the track that plays when you fight the Black Fang bosses. I think that part is really neat. It's funny to me how most bosses get these super special exclusive S-rank weapons, but then they gave Jeremy a weak-ass rune sword, and instead this random generic druid gets the Gespenst tome. I guess they didn't want to put Theodore, you know, the chapter 19XX boss in there since he's Hector mode exclusive in a secret chapter, but I always thought it was funny that Nerval just is like, oh, I still have this S-rank Dark Tome. I'll just give it to that guy, I guess. Overall, I think this one is good, not great. I'm going to put in like, I think high B or low A is being very nice to it. It's nice. FE8, if we only look at the final battle itself, I think it's again pretty lame. It's just one Demon King in the middle of an empty room. The fact that he summons enemies would be more threatening if it wasn't so easy to kill him in the first 2 completely free turns. I actually kind of like how almost every unit can hurt him with the Sacred Twins because it makes all your units relevant as opposed to some other games where it's like restricted to your Lord only or like maybe 1 or 2 more guys. I wish this battle was a bit more challenging than it is, but we cannot pretend that it isn't. We live in this world and not the alternate timeline. The theme in this battle is very upbeat. It almost doesn't even feel like a final battle. I get why the association is there because it does play in the final battle, but I think it's so different from the other themes that to me it feels, well, not like a final battle. But I don't hate it. It's a good track. I just prefer the other ones. Looking at part 1 of this chapter real briefly, I do like this one a lot, and it's mostly because of the music that plays in that one. I use this song a lot in my videos, and it's just one of my favorite tracks in the series. Lion, or Leon, in my head I pronounced it as Leon before, and then I learned later it was Lion, so I'm going to say it wrong both times. Great semi-final boss, both narratively and gameplay-wise. He doesn't move, but they made him threatening somehow anyway by making a good formation of Gorgons and Wights around him. He is like the only enemy in this chapter that doesn't take super effective damage from the Sacred Twins, and because they also made him so bulky and so strong and like so hard hitting, it's actually not easy to kill him quickly. Generally, I kill everything around him very slowly, or I fight him with Myrrh, who has enough resistance to survive the onslaught of the attacks you face there. But almost nobody else can do that, which I think is pretty impressive. The battle also has a pair of mobile Draco zombies in good positions, like near those corridors. That's pretty smart. Everything else in the chapter not that scary because you can just OHKO almost everything with the Sacred Twins, so I think the chapter is a bit too easy on the whole, but it's not so easy that it's boring. So I'm going to be generous because I like Sacred Stones. I'll factor in part 1, and I'll throw it in B tier again, a little bit below Blazing Blade, but I go either way on that one. I do think they're both better than Genealogy though. FE9, Tellius time, oh boy. This battle is at the Crimea Castle Courtyard, and I think it's noteworthy for being the most mobile final boss in the series. Ashnard moves and attacks when someone is in his range, very much in character for him. Now, the FE6 boss technically does the same, but they have one move, and Ashnard has like a Morbillion and he flies, and he's perfectly positioned on his balcony to do so. And that is easily the best part of the final chapter in Path of Radiance. I mostly have negative things to say about this battle from here, I'm afraid. The battle doesn't have unique music other than when you're fighting Ashnard, which makes it feel less like a final battle and more like just another battle. Like, I think the player phase theme that also continues through enemy phase is just another fight. I don't think that was the intention. I think they might have wanted to have another track here, but didn't get to it. And the rest of the map just feels very enemy spammy. This is more of a critique of FE9 in general than this battle specifically, but it's more tedium than challenge no matter what difficulty you're on. It's just very slow because it's FE9, and that sucks when there's so many enemies. And if you take a long time, and I mean not real time but turns, then Ashnard actually starts moving by himself, which I think is pretty cool, but I didn't know that until like my previous Iron Man, and I think most people will get to him before he moves. There are only a few characters that can hurt Ashnard. One of them is Ike and the Ragnell. That's good if your Ike is trained and strong, but if you got RNG screwed, or you're doing like a 0% growth challenge, or for some other reason you didn't train him all the way, then it really sucks. It really sucks to fight Ashnard with a screwed Ike, because the other characters are all much worse at fighting Ashnard for a lot of reasons. Enna is slow and needs help from something like the Resolve skill to really do damage on Ashnard. Nazir has better speed, he doesn't get double that base, which is an improvement, but if you have Nazir, then your Ike is probably fine anyway, so it isn't really of much help. And I've never had to try with the dragons because my Ike is usually good enough, so my dragon opinions are just kind of hearsay and checking stats online. They're far from ideal. Gifka, Tabarn, and Nasala are okay, but on hard and maniac mode, you don't get them from the start, so they can't help you against Ashnard initially. On normal mode, they work as probably intended, but on hard and above, Ashnard has 2 phases, and you only get the Laguz Royal for the second phase. And I think the first and second phases are like way too similar. They're almost the exact same, except phase 2 just has slightly higher stats. Narratively, the fact that Ashnard is willing to use the medallion to become stronger at the cost of anything is good, but not really a big fan of blessed armor that makes him immune to everyone, or almost everyone. Especially because the Goto-like units in this game that are like either unavailable for phase 1 like the Laguz Royals, or just not very good like Enna, or the superfluous like Nasir is. It's funny, in that way I guess they're fading to be Goto, because Goto is kind of like that too. So while I really like how much of a threat Ashnard is on the actual map, it's like the only really positive thing I have to say about FE9. And I think this one, I had it in C initially, but I kind of want to put it in D now. I'm sorry. I really love FE9. Like the rest of the game, I'm like so much in love with, but the final battle kind of blew. Alright, let's do a palette cleanser now, because I just bashed Tellius. I think we need to repair our little bit. This is, spoiler alert, the best final battle in the whole series. I love this one. You're up against Ashira, who is at the center of an otherwise mostly empty map. She is guarded by 8 passive auras all around her, as well as a couple of spirits that move around you and attack you. The auras form a wall, and you have to KO them all before you can even attack Ashira. Each of the walls has 90 HP and 30 in each defense, plus 10 for either defense or resistance depending on what kind of terrain tile they're on. And the auras don't attack you, but they do cause recoil damage if you attack them. And you can stop that recoil with either Nihil or Parity, which are basically the only like combat skills that matter, because Nihil turns the rest of them all off. They have Nihil, just to clarify. And the key to winning quickly is to optimize your damage to break through the barriers before Ashira's attacks kill you, because Ashira does these like massive AoE attacks that just hurt all your units or like inflict status on them, and it's really painful to stick around for more than like 3 turns in this chapter. I love this battle because it is so rewarding to play well, but not so challenging that it really discourages new players from trying again. I find it so satisfying to find the right like positioning for my units and break down the barriers ASAP. And especially important is to use the Dragon units, Enna, Gareth, and Nazir, because they have pool abilities that increase the damage and hit rates of adjacent units. So when you combine that with things like Kanto to move again, or Raphael to figure the best units, or the parity skill, and optimizing which units attacks which barrier, I just have so much fun strategizing around this chapter. Even though the enemies that I'm attacking are totally passive, I think this is the best gameplay that a final battle can have. Of course, the music, it kicks ass like always. It's a very daunting atmosphere. It's even got a new Game Plus incentive and an extra unit that joins during the battle if you play the game for the second time and you fulfill certain requirements. The one thing I kind of dislike is Ashira's AoE attacks. They're a bit hard to prepare for unless you look them up online or you play the map multiple times. Most of the time, I think this battle lasts for like 2 or 3 turns, at least that's for me, and even for beginners I imagine it's like 4 or 5 at most. And it's not too hard to notice that you take less damage if you're further away, and that physically frail units take more damage than tanky ones from a turn 1 AoE attack, which is physical. So I think the battle does a good job of teaching you what you need to know in a short amount of time, to the point where it doesn't get frustrating. The spirits, they're kind of cool too. They're enemies with basically infinite move, and they seem really threatening because of that, but they're not strong enough to insta-kill your units, so you have some wiggle room. I usually don't see anyone have my unit die to the spirits. Nowadays, I tend to just trivialize them by putting Provoke on a unit with 1 range, but they add some life to a fight that would otherwise just be Ashira and her barriers sitting around doing nothing, so I like those too. Now, when you break Ashira's barriers, you can finally attack her. She puts up a good fight with 1 or 2 range and so much bulk and attack power, though usually not enough to one-shot your best units. There's that nasty surprise when you kill her with someone that is not Ike, and she just goes, "Oh no you don't," and she just comes back and you gotta do it again. I do think narratively it is a little odd that only Ike can finish her. First of all, Ike didn't need this kind of plot sword. I'm trying to think of like an equivalent to plot armor, but offensively, because Ike is the one doing the killing instead, but you know what I mean. But Ike was already cool. He didn't really need an extra reason to be cooler. One of the reasons that he has a reputation for hijacking Radiant Dawn is he does that thing in the finale where he's the only one who can kill him. Second of all, Yune blessed all your strongest weapons, not just the Ragnell, for the purpose of being a Shira, so I don't really get why it's only Ike that can finish her off. I might have missed something, but I don't think this lines up with the foreshadowing that we got. That's just a minor gripe though, like I really just tried to nitpick it so hard. This is the best I can come up with. Everything else about this fight is excellent. Not to mention that if I really wanted to, I could count all the endgame chapters as a build up to this, because this final chapter has 5 parts to it. Radiant Dawn's finale is just so excellent. This is 10 out of 10. Best one by a freaking mile. So because we did all the remakes already, we can just skip straight to Awakening. And something funny happens when you start the battle in the Awakening final chapter. The moment you want to start the actual fight, Grima says, alright, all your HP goes to 1. And the first time I saw that, I was like, whoa, that's really cool. It's kind of daunting, actually. In practice, it isn't really. It would be 1 single fortify away from being cured and just ignored. But it was kind of unique. I thought it was cool. But no, then they undid it in another cutscene. And then the battle just starts like any other. So, bit of missed opportunity, perhaps. I know it wouldn't make a big difference. I just thought that disappointing moments. And I thought I'm never going to have another chance to talk about it in a video. So might as well do it here. Just kidding. I'm absolutely going to talk about it again. The music for Awakening is, of course, great all around, and the final chapter is no exception. It absolutely knocks it out of the park. I don't know anyone who dislikes it purpose. I'm sure, now that I've said that, someone is going to write that in the comments, but generally speaking, I think this is a very beloved track for very good reasons. Most of the map, unfortunately, is just a wide open space with similarly strong enemies to what you've been fighting for the last couple of chapters, so I don't think that's very special. I will give it bonus points, like I guess cool points, for being on a literal dragon's back. That is very original. Grima himself, or herself I suppose, I'm a little torn on Grima. For normal mode and hard mode, I think Grima is perfectly fine. They are threatening, but you can overcome the giant stats and the range and the skills with just good units, especially Falcon users like Chrom and Lucina. Perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with Grima, just your good old dragon boss that counters you always, hits very hard, and you can hit him hard in return over the course of like a couple attacks, turns, however you've optimized it. On Lunatic though, there's a massive stat jump for Grima. I think all of their stats has become insanely high, to the point of being pretty prohibitive. And I think it is possible to get soft-locked here on a blind playthrough. Or arguably worse, you could have a unit with the potential to beat Grima, but Grima has Ignis and Pavis, 2 skills with a random chance to screw you over, so you might be forced to reset over and over for a good outcome. And Rightful God gives Grima 30% extra activation rate on top of the 50% they already had. So you're going to run into a lot of 80% Ignises and Pavises, which I can tell you from experience is the opposite of fun. Now, you could, in Awakening, always grind out of battle, but on Lunatic that's not really an option due to overpowered the Risen are on the overworld encounters, so once you get there, you're kind of stuck with what you have, and you might not have a great out to fighting Grima. That said, I don't think this is 100% a good reason to dislike the fight, because I also like that the game has a final boss that you actually want to prepare for. The stat jump of Lunatic is not really going to catch a whole lot of people blind, because Lunatic itself is so intimidating that a lot of people will probably downgrade to hard or normal if they're not ready for it. So if someone makes it to the final chapter on Lunatic, they're probably ready to face something serious. I made this video a long time ago, a Fire Emblem Pitfalls video about how it's a pitfall to play an early chapter in preparation of a final chapter, because usually it's not necessary. It's better to focus on short-term benefits in Fire Emblem, because the late game tends to be easier than the early game, relatively speaking. But Grima kind of subverts that and actually requires some long-term planning. I know, for example, that Robin, when the Robin vs. Fake saga, Fake is much better at fighting Grima than Robin, and Robin can solo the entirety of the rest of the game beyond a certain point. But Robin actually has a lot of trouble with Grima, and even Fake too, despite him being absolutely amazing, still needs bow rank to beat Grima. The bows can bypass Pavis, which is pretty cool. So, little torn on Grima. I think in the end I'll average it out to a nice C tier. Not sure exactly where to put it, but for now I guess I'll just slide it in at the top. You know, gotta optimize people getting mad over it. Alright, We'll get into Fates. I'm scrolling way too much here, hold up. There we go. So Fates has 3 different routes. Unfortunately, they've all been represented by different icons on my tier list makers, so we can talk about 3 of them one at a time. So I'm going to talk about Conquest and Birthright. I kind of dislike both of their finales for one thing mainly. There's no saving in the actual final battle, like during your prep screen. You get a prep screen, they just disabled the save option. If you have to reset the final battle because you get a game over or a crucial character died, you have to play the previous map over again. I don't like these types of difficulty increases. It's just tedious and doesn't add extra challenge. If you as a player have proven that you have what it takes to overcome the previous chapter, what is there to be gained from being forced to do that again? I get that it adds some stakes to the final battle, but especially the Conquest one really encourages trial and error to get through. And it's really punishing for single mistakes, you know, Conquest being Conquest. I have seen arguments that this was made to prevent soft locks, that if you weren't ready for the final, you could go back and like do my castle again or do the previous chapter. I don't know if I really buy that, especially because the game has done like this kind of thing for, say, Revelation as well. There's like a chapter like near the end of Revelation where you get that kind of thing too. But I mean, I guess that is a pro of it, but I'm not a fan for most playthroughs. Generally, you don't soft lock yourself and farm them. Anyway, in Birthright, you just fight Garon for a second time, but as a dragon. I actually found that fight rather difficult the first time that I played Birthright Lunatic because his stats were so stacked. Admittedly, part of that is because I was just Ryoma soloing because I was tired of the game, and Ryoma solo is not a great way to fight that Garon. I watched some other people play it on YouTube in preparation for this, and it looked like they were having a fine time with it. You start very close to him, and it's pretty easy to kill. There's like one enemy in the way, just kill him, just get through. Dragon Skin is a pain in the ass to work around because it reduces your damage by so much, especially on critical hits. But I feel like, and the main way to get around that is just use Corrin with the Yato, because the Yato takes much less damage reduction from Dragon Skin. That does come with the problem that I mentioned about another game, that relying on your lord to not get RNG screwed can be bad, but I feel like if you have good enough other units, other builds, then you're probably going to be okay. I've never heard of that someone getting like soft locks by Birthright Garon. I noticed one time and also heard that the AI of Birthright Garon in the final is beyond broken, and sometimes he just kind of doesn't attack or kind of moves away and does nothing. I think that has to do with the gimmick of the Dragon Veins going on the map, but I don't really know enough about it to have a more in-depth opinion on it, but I saw like a long Reddit post on that sometimes, so it has to be correct. It's been a long time since I played, if you can't tell, Birthright, but I remember not having a super great time. It's in combination with the preps problem, I just really don't like this final chapter. Sometimes I'm able to redeem a rating like this by taking into account the previous chapter, but I don't really like the previous chapter all that much anyway. So yeah, this is going to be our second dislike, I'm afraid. I'm going to put it below Path of Radiance. This is the worst one so far, I think. Conquest, I think, is better because, first of all, Takumi is just more interesting than Garon, both narratively and gameplay-wise. The map with Takumi is really daunting, with a lot of different enemy types all around you, in an interesting way. The Lunatic version of Conquest Endgame is infamous for the inevitable end on the Enfeebled Maids and the Master Ninjas, as well as all the other stat stabs around. It's one of the few points in Conquest where you can't just stat stack your way to victory. You do need to engage with the map in a different way than just trying to be stronger than the enemies, which usually works out fine for 99% of Conquest. Playing the map straight on Lunatic is so extremely difficult that I think most experienced people tend to just prepare a warp skip, or rather a rescue skip, to get past the chapter. You save like 3 rescue rods uses for this one when you only get 4 in the entire game. It's quite a commitment, but it's really worth it. I never want to play this map straight again, and I only ever played it straight on hard. I tried on Lunatic once and I just decided, nope, we're not doing this. In and of itself, I don't mind that there is a way to skip the final chapter and that it actually rewards you for doing so by letting you get around all the enfeebled enemies, because it adds a preparation layer that I also liked about the previous entry. But if the map is so annoying that players would rather skip it than play it straight, I do think it's worth docking some points for. That said, I think if I went back to play normal or hard now and play the final chapter, I'd probably have an okay time doing it, you know, the normal way, not the rescue skip way. So it's not a terrible map, but on Lunatic it feels a little, I think, overtuned would be the right term. Takumi himself is an absolute pain to kill, but that high threshold that he has in order to, like, I think you usually try to 3 kill him with a brave weapon because he gets like guard gauge. It does mean you have to, again, prepare for it a little bit, which is neat. It always gives me a bit of decision paralysis because I know when I'm starting a Conquest run, I can't just get through it chapter by chapter. I have to actually prepare someone that can beat Takumi down if I'm playing Lunatic, because otherwise I'm just like screwed. So I enjoy the preparations layer, but it's also like, it feels restrictive on your playthrough a little bit. I do enjoy that he has that Awakening style pair up, where he's the only unit in the entire game that gets both guard gauge and a dual strike. Everyone else has to choose between the two, but he just gets both, refuses to elaborate. I will also say, and I swear this is the only time I'm going to bring it up, I think the Fates story takes away a bit from the stakes in both the Birthright and Conquest endgame. The fact that the same story beats basically happen in both finales. Look it up in the Fireman Wiki if you don't believe me. The summary is like the same thing, they just change a couple names and words. It's basically just the Yato breaking and Korn dying and going to heaven and coming back. It just feels like they couldn't really be bothered to write something unique for both routes. I get that these two routes are supposed to be mirrors of one another, but I think there is a line between clever parallels and just doing the same thing twice and saying, oh, that's a reference. But I didn't factor story into the other entries when I'm rating them, and so I won't do so here in the interest of fairness, because I'm all about fairness. So I'm going to put Conquest at the bottom of C, and Birthright is like the only title I'm going to put here for now, along with Path of Radiance. Next up is Rev, or Revelation, or some people call it Revelations. It's going to be the only time where I'm going to put that like pretty far up. I thought the Revelation endgame was pretty cool. You fight Anankos the dragon with his 2 arms and a head in some kind of space-like environment. I thought that was pretty sick when I first did it. The fight is hard enough where even the broken royals like Xander and Ryoma struggle to trivialize it, unlike the entirety of the rest of Fates. And there's enemies coming in to fight for control of the area, so it isn't just a matter of chipping away at the HP bars with your best units. You gotta actually, fight your way through the map and beat down the arms, and then beat down the head. And then you kill the eye at the very end. There's the whole phase change. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to why the eye is just floating there. You also have to kill that part, but whatever, I'm not going to question it too much. I'll roll with it. Also, I think Rev Endgame has the best version of Lost in Thoughts All Alone playing. Yes, I do like that one better than the Shigure version. I think it's pretty fire overall. So I'm going to give Rev, as a special exception, I'm going to give Rev an A for effort. I don't expect to do this ever again in my life, but here we are. Alright, 3 houses. This one has 4 entries, so I'm kind of going to just speed round them and take the average, and I'll go by the order that I played them in personally, because that's how I experienced them. So my first route for 3 houses was playing the Golden Deer on hard mode. I really like playing this one. You got Nemesis, and you got a big swamp full of strong enemies, including the 10 elites, or like dark zombie dragons versions of them, I guess. Nemesis is supposed to be invincible until you kill the elites, and then his stats drop enough for you to kill him. Apparently you can cheese this a little bit by killing a few or even 0 elites, but my first playthrough I just played it straight and just did what the map wanted me to do. There's also a group of enemies at the bottom, and I think killing them or killing one of them allows you to turn the swamp into normal tiles so everyone can traverse further. Didn't matter too much for me because I figured out wyverns were good, but I'm sure that helps if you have a lot of units in other classes. God Shattering Star, which is what plays during the final chapter, is a track that a lot of fans like. I think it's fine every once in a while to listen to, but it's not my style personally. I'll still give it points for that because I acknowledge that it's a hype song and it's a taste thing, so good start there. Good first final map for 3 houses. Then after that I played Azure Moon or Blue Lions on hard mode on New Game Plus, that was new at the time. That one is the Edelgard Castle map, but a little different from how it looks in Golden Deer and Silver Snow, but I didn't know that at the time. I really like what they did with Edelgard. I mean, I love it for her, but giving a boss 2 infinite range attacks is something like very daring, especially because you use both of them in one turn. And they programmed her AI such that she rarely ganks one person, because she always goes for Dimitri with one of them, I believe. And again, you can do a bit of cheese by using like Retribution to always counter her, or Sacred Shield to always block the attack. But whatever, it works the first time around when you don't know of these broken things. The rest of the castle map I don't have particularly strong memories of. I remember it being like alright. I imagine if you played Maddening it would be a bit more infuriating though because of all the stat inflation. Then I played Crimson Flower on Maddening. I already saw the map on hard mode, so there were no surprises there for me. Fighting big monster Rhea was pretty cool. I like the monsters with a bazillion tiles that you can break with gambits. I think Three Houses overdid it a little bit with the generic monster enemies overall, so their coolness factor got reduced by just getting used to it. So by the time I got there, I was a little bit tired of them, but when I see a boss that's like 16 tiles big or whatever, I don't really hold it against them. I think it's like 9. I don't think they did 16. That would be a lot, wouldn't it? I really need to replay Three Houses. Anyway, I don't hold it against them for having those as bosses. It's very fitting for bosses. I just dislike the generic monsters when you have to kill like 15 of them on a map, which you also kind of had to do there, I believe. But they were like the automatons, the robot things. The map itself on Crimson Flower, I think, is a bit tedious with all the fire and stairs reducing your movement, especially on Maddening, where reinforcements are ambush spawns and a lot of the enemies are flyers. It's just a bit too restricting to be fun for me. Having mounted units, like locked mounted units like Paladins, just being screwed out of their movement by so much compared to flyers is just a little bit too unfair, I think. You can cheese this map with like Wyvern Edelgard and using Raging Storm, which allows you to take another action after using it. I don't mind cheese too much, like with the Warp Staff, but I do think the map should make me want to play it, and I do not particularly want to play this map. This is my least favorite finale so far in Three Houses. Now, both Blue Lions and Black Eagles share Apex of the World as their final track, and I like that one. I would have liked each route to be unique, but I don't mind this one being a repeat. I feel like the meaning of the song is a bit different for each route somehow. Then there is the Silver Snow finale. This one I played by myself the first time around for my Violet solo, which I did on hard and I had to redo it for Manning when that came out. That was a very tedious experience, so I'm going to be a little bit biased here. It's probably a lot better with a proper team, but this map is just a massive clusterfuck. There's these super annoying like white dragon enemies anywhere with these insane stats and Miracle, and if I recall correctly, they have like Seal Strength. It took me forever to fight those. The music for this one is by far my favorite final track in Three Houses though. I was not ready for Funeral of Flowers when I first heard it. It's so fucking good. Forgive me, by the way, for my critiques of these tracks not being at all very in-depth. I'm just saying like, oh, I like this track, it's good, it kicks ass. I just know good music when I hear it, alright? That's all I know about music. Rhea, the final boss herself, we can't forget about her. Very painful to fight, again, due to Miracle, which she has a massive proc rate for. I think it helps a bit to think of Miracle as a guaranteed activation, and then you have to find ways around it, like with multi-hit weapons. If you look at it like that, then it doesn't feel as bad when it does activate, because I think as Fire Emblem fans, we're used to think of Miracle as a lucky save that most of the time doesn't happen, so your brain automatically goes, I got screwed, the RNG is bugged, and that part of our brain is never good for our enjoyment. I don't have experience fighting Rhea with an actual team, and I'm not going to pretend I do, so I'm going to pretend I like it about as much as I like fighting the Crimson Flower version, and yeah, overall not a big fan of this map. The boss is okay. So overall for Three Houses, I think we have a healthy mix of good and bad. There's a lot of ambition in the final chapter of Three Houses, so I think I'll average out at around like a B tier, put it like ahead of the Genealogy, I suppose, and that way everyone gets mad. Alright, Engage. So the final battle against Sombron can be accessed through the Somniel Terrace. When I first got that message, I could never get over how funny that was. So first, in the first part of the map, you fight human Sombron, and there's a bunch of strong people near him. You just kind of kill Sombron in 1 or 2 turns with almost no effort. I like that they put a bad ending in there that almost nobody will find organically, since the only way to do so is to kill off Alir. That was really funny when I realized that could happen. The real battle against Sombron is familiar territory in a lot of ways. He's in the middle of the map and you're right near him, and so you could attack him right away, but his stats are so absurdly high that it is of no use, and they also made him dodge almost all chain attacks just so you cannot cheese him that way. But you can reduce his stats by killing other final bosses all around the map, and if you wipe them, then he is much more vulnerable. I had a good time doing this my first playthrough because it was all new, so everything feels better on your first playthrough. And the concept of killing mini-bosses and then big bosses, as I said in other examples of this, usually just kind of works for me for final chapters. That said, I feel like this part of the game was also what they did last in their development cycle when they felt like the deadline was getting closer, and they didn't really spend as much time on this as they could have. The final Mini-bosses have no portraits or voice acting, they're all just kind of dark bishop dudes that only get their identity through the dialogue and their status screen. I think that was really underwhelming, and I expect a lot better for an epic finale. They take effective damage from people that use the emblems from their game of origin, so for example Medius takes effective damage from Marth. I think that was a fun choice, but it also makes them really easy if you happen to pick the right one. Also, most likely you will only see maybe 4 of these, because that's all they made room for on the map initially, and since Sombron's barriers are weakened based on how many of them are still remaining on the map, you can pretty easily clear him before new ones even appear. I usually don't skip content on my first playthrough, but I did do so here because I didn't really feel like sticking around for more generic enemies that were supposed to be final bosses from other games. I will say though, the process of getting the right units to the right final boss was interesting enough. This game gives you a lot of different mobility tools like Warp, Rescue, a Dancer, Dance the Goddess, and figuring out which one to use for which purpose, I thought it was pretty fun. And I also like the electric sounding music for this one. So I would place Engage. We can be generous and give it a BT as well. That's fine. Alright, that's the whole list. Let me know your incorrect disagreements down below. I took a little longer to make this video. It started off as, let me just record another off-the-cuff tier list, and it kind of got out of hand and turned into a semi-scripted video with some actual editing going on. But if that made it more fun to watch for you guys, then it was worth the effort to me. This does mean I had a little less time to edit for my daily uploads, so it might be a little bit before my next video. Thank you for your patience. I'm gonna put Velezark in the bottom now because Velezark loves ruining my S ranks, and I'll hope you have a nice day.